The letter slipped from Jimmy Stewart's fingers and fluttered to the kitchen floor. He didn't bend to pick it up. Couldn't. The name at the bottom had stopped his heart. Robert Henley. Written in handwriting he recognized from 1946, from a man who was supposed to be dead. But Robert Henley wasn't dead. And that meant Jimmy Stewart had been living the wrong life for 40 years. Jimmy's coffee cup sat forgotten on the marble counter, steam rising like ghosts. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The morning sun streamed through Beverly Hills windows, but the kitchen felt cold as a tomb. The 78-year-old actor, America's beloved everyman with the gentle drawl and honest face, stared at the signature on the yellowed paper. His weathered hands couldn't stop trembling. The Beverly Hills kitchen felt like it was tilting sideways. 40 years. 40 years of carrying a burden that was never his to carry. The phone rang. Jimmy set the letter down next to his cold eggs and walked toward the sound. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else, because if Robert Henley was alive and happy, then Jimmy Stewart had been living someone else's nightmare for 4 decades. "Hello?" His voice barely a whisper. "Jimmy, Frank Capra here. Christ, you sound terrible. You sick? Frank?" His old director, the man who'd made Jimmy a star. "Frank, what if you spent 40 years believing you'd committed a terrible sin, only to find out you'd done something good? What the hell are you talking about?" Jimmy looked down at the letter. The letter that was about to rewrite his entire adult life. "I'll call you back." But to understand what this letter meant to Jimmy Stewart, you need to know the story that had been destroying him for 40 years. The story of Robert Henley, and the day Jimmy thought he'd stolen a man's soul. It was 1946. Jimmy had come home from the war with medals and nightmares, with a distinguished flying cross and memories that woke him screaming. The tall actor who'd charmed audiences was different now, quieter, carrying invisible wounds. Hollywood was calling him back. That's when agent Leland Hayward called with the offer that would haunt Jimmy for decades. "Jimmy, Republic Pictures wants you for their Western Canyon Trail. 50,000 plus points. Only problem, they already promised it to someone else. Kid named Robert Henley." Jimmy knew the name. Robert Henley, 25 years old, tall and dark-haired with intelligent eyes. He'd done Broadway work, but word was he had real talent. More than that, he had hunger from working construction between auditions, supporting a wife and baby daughter. They promised him the part. Herbert Yates gave his word personally, but he wants star power now. He'll break his promise to Henley if you'll take it. Jimmy felt something cold settle in his stomach. He pictured the young actor, probably at home with his family, thinking his years of struggle were finally over. What happens to Henley? Not your problem. That's the business. But Jimmy made it his problem when he took the part anyway, telling himself it was just business. What he didn't know was that this decision would haunt him based on a complete lie. 3 weeks later, Jimmy was eating lunch at the Brown Derby when he overheard 2 agents talking. Jimmy had been struggling since the war, prone to believing the worst about himself. The nightmares made him jumpy, suspicious that every setback was somehow his fault. "You hear about that kid Henley, the one who lost the Republic Picture to Stewart?" Jimmy's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Complete breakdown. Wife left him, took the baby, found him in some flop house, tried to kill himself with pills. He's at Cedars now. The words hit Jimmy like artillery shells. He'd destroyed a man's life. The young actor was lying in a hospital bed because Jimmy Stewart wanted to feel safe after the war. Jimmy rushed to the hospital, but Robert Henley was already gone, vanished with no forwarding address. Jimmy hired investigators, searched for months, but Robert Henley had disappeared completely. That's when Jimmy Stewart began his 40-year penance. The guilt became Jimmy's constant companion. He would wake up at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat, seeing Robert Henley's face in his dreams. The nightmares from the war had faded, but these new nightmares were worse, because Jimmy knew he'd caused them. He started turning down parts when younger actors were considered. He began quietly mentoring newcomers, making calls, recommending young talent. He established a scholarship fund for drama students, though he insisted it remain anonymous. The money came from his percentage points on Canyon Trail, the blood money, as he thought of it. People called him a gentleman, a class act. They had no idea that every act of kindness was an attempt to balance the cosmic scales. Every award felt hollow. Every ovation made him sick. He'd look at applauding audiences and wonder if they'd cheer if they knew what he'd really done. The war nightmares eventually faded, replaced by deeper guilt. Jimmy would dream about Robert Henley, alone, hopeless, reaching for pills because the pain was too much. By 1975, Jimmy was convinced Robert Henley was dead. The guilt had become part of his identity. But then everything changed in a way that would shock you completely. Young journalist Sarah Chen approached him after an interview. "Mr. Stewart, you mentioned Robert Henley. I'd like to hear that story." Something in her tone made Jimmy pay attention. "Why? I've been researching him for 6 months, and I think you need to know what really happened." They met at Jimmy's house. Sarah Chen, the serious reporter with intelligent eyes, spread documents across his coffee table. "Mr. Stewart, Robert Henley didn't disappear because he lost that part. He disappeared because he wanted you to have it." Jimmy stared at her. "What? I found him. He's alive. Been running a community theater in Oregon for 30 years, teaching kids. When I told him about my research, he laughed, said losing that part was the best thing that ever happened to him." Sarah pulled out a yellowed letter. "He wrote this in 1946 but never sent it." Jimmy's hands shook as he read. "Dear Mr. Stewart, I heard about the casting change. I wanted you to know I'm not angry. You see, I know why they chose you. You have truth in your performances that can't be taught. I'm leaving Hollywood, not because I'm bitter, but because I realized something. I was so focused on becoming a star that I forgot why I started acting. I love helping people tell stories. There's a town in Oregon that needs someone to run their community theater. The pay is nothing, but they're doing real work. I think that's where I belong. Don't feel guilty. You're going to honor the material. P.S. The breakdown story isn't about me. There was another actor, Jimmy Morrison, who had troubles then. Hollywood got its gossip mixed up. Jimmy read it 3 times before the words sank in. He's been in Oregon this whole time, 30 years, built that theater from nothing, trained hundreds of kids, says you both found your true purpose because of what happened. The room was spinning. Jimmy felt like he'd been carrying a dead body for 40 years, only to discover it was just an empty coat. You're not ready for what happened when Jimmy finally called Oregon. That night, Jimmy called the number Sarah Chen had given him. "Ashland Community Theater, this is Jenny. Is Robert Henley available?" "Mr. Bob, hold on." Then a voice Jimmy hadn't heard in 40 years, deeper now but warm with contentment. "Hello, this is Bob Henley. Robert." Jimmy's voice came out as a croak. "This is Jimmy Stewart." There was a long silence, then laughter. Rich, genuine laughter. "Well, I'll be damned. Jimmy Stewart, how are you?" "Robert, I need to apologize for taking that part, for ruining your life, ruining my life. Jimmy, you saved it." Jimmy couldn't speak. The words didn't make sense. "Jimmy, I think somebody's been feeding you tall tales. I never had a breakdown, and I certainly never tried to hurt myself, but I heard at the Brown Derby about Jimmy Morrison, probably. Poor guy had troubles around that time. But that wasn't me. I was already halfway to Oregon by then." Jimmy felt like the world was tilting sideways. "Oregon, best decision I ever made. Jimmy, can I tell you something? Losing that part was like getting a kick in the pants from the universe. I needed that kick." They talked for hours. Robert told him about Oregon, about arriving in Ashland with nothing but a suitcase and hope. He described his first group of students, 12 teenagers who'd never acted before but had fire in their eyes. "I remember this one kid, Tommy," Robert said, his voice warm with memory. "Stuttered so bad he could barely order food at restaurants. But put him on stage and something magical happened. The words just flowed. He's a speech therapist now, helps other kids find their voices." Jimmy listened, tears streaming down his face, as Robert described 30 years of small miracles. The shy girl who became a confident teacher, the troubled boy who found purpose in playwriting, the whole families who bonded over community productions. "You should see this place now, Jimmy. We've got 3 theaters, a training program that sends kids to Juilliard, a summer festival that brings people from all over the country. But you know what I'm proudest of?" "What's that?" "Last month I got a letter from a girl I taught 15 years ago. She's a teacher now in a little town in Montana. She started a drama program at her school because of what she learned here. She said I taught her that theater isn't about becoming famous, it's about helping people find their voices." Jimmy felt something breaking open in his chest, not breaking apart, but breaking open like dawn. "Robert, all these years I've been helping young actors, mentoring kids. I thought I was making up for what I did to you. But if I didn't really hurt you, Jimmy, listen to me." Robert's voice became serious, almost paternal. "You've probably helped more actors get their start than anyone else in Hollywood. Do you know how many careers you've launched? How many kids got their break because Jimmy Stewart made a phone call or wrote a recommendation?" Jimmy had never really counted. The mentoring, the scholarship fund, the quiet recommendations, it had all felt like penance, like trying to balance some cosmic scale that could never be balanced. "And I've trained maybe 500 young actors in 30 years, Robert continued. "Some went to Broadway, some to Hollywood, some became teachers themselves, but all of them learned something here about confidence and creativity and using your voice to tell stories that matter." "So you're saying," "I'm saying maybe what looked like the worst thing that could happen was really the best thing that could happen. For both of us. You became the kind of man who lifts other people up. I found my true calling. Maybe the universe knew what it was doing when it brought us to that moment in 1946. When they finally hung up, Jimmy sat in his kitchen for a long time, staring at that 40-year-old letter. For the first time in decades, the house felt peaceful. The ticking of the expensive clock wasn't oppressive anymore. The morning light through the windows felt warm instead of cold. He called his housekeeper and told her to take the day off. He called his agent and canceled his meetings. For the first time in 40 years, Jimmy Stewart had nothing to atone for. The weight he'd carried since 1946 was gone, replaced by something he'd forgotten how to feel, pure uncomplicated relief. He walked through his house, looking at the Academy Awards and photographs with different eyes. They weren't monuments to his guilt anymore. They were just awards, just pictures of a life well lived. But this story wasn't over yet. The universe had one more surprise that would prove just how perfectly everything had worked out. The next month, Jimmy flew to Oregon. The flight to Portland gave him time to process what he'd learned. 40 years of guilt dissolving into something else, gratitude maybe, or wonder at the strange way life works. The drive to Ashland took him through mountains and forests that reminded him of Pennsylvania, of the simple beauty he'd almost forgotten existed. He parked across the street from the Ashland Community Theater and sat for a moment, watching people come and go, teenagers with backpacks and dreams, parents dropping off kids, elderly volunteers carrying costumes and props. The building was a converted warehouse. Nothing fancy, just a functional space where real work got done. He walked into the lobby just as rehearsal was ending. The first thing he noticed was the laughter, genuine, joyful laughter echoing off the walls. The second thing was the walls themselves, covered with photographs of productions going back decades. Kids in costume, beaming with pride, groups of young actors taking their first bows, and in many of the photos a tall man with kind eyes, always in the background, always focused on his students. "Can I help you?" A young woman with paint-stained hands looked up from organizing programs. "I'm looking for Robert Henley. Mr. Bob? He's just finishing notes with the kids. Are you here about the summer program?" Something like that. She led him down a hallway lined with more photos, more smiling faces, more evidence of lives changed and dreams nurtured. They passed rehearsal rooms where he could hear young voices working on scenes, practicing songs, learning the craft that had shaped Jimmy's own life. And then he saw him. Robert Henley was sitting in a circle with a dozen teenagers, all of them hanging on his every word. He was older now, silver-haired, lined face, the kind of gentle authority that comes from decades of nurturing young talent. But his eyes were the same intelligent, compassionate eyes Jimmy remembered from 40 years ago. "Remember," Robert was saying to the kids, "the audience doesn't care how nervous you are. They want you to succeed. They want to believe in the story you're telling them. So trust the work you've done, trust each other, and trust that what you have to say matters." One of the teenagers, a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, raised her hand. "Mr. Bob, what if we forget our lines?" Robert smiled with infinite patience. "Then you remember that theater is live, and live means anything can happen. Some of the best moments I've ever seen on stage were when actors forgot their lines and had to find their way back to the story. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. Be afraid of playing it safe." Jimmy stood in the doorway, watching, and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, pure admiration for another person's work. This wasn't about fame or money or recognition. This was about something deeper, more important. "All right, that's enough wisdom for one night," Robert said, standing up. "Go home, get some rest, and I'll see you tomorrow. Remember, opening night is just a week away, and you're going to be magnificent." The kids dispersed, chattering excitedly, some stopping to hug Robert, others calling out, "Thanks, Mr. Bob," as they headed for the door. And then Jimmy and Robert were alone. Robert looked up and saw him standing there. For a moment his face was blank, confused. Then recognition dawned, and he broke into the biggest smile Jimmy had ever seen. "Well, I'll be damned. You actually came." They embraced like old friends, though they'd never really been friends at all. "Come on," Robert said. "Let me show you what you helped me build." He gave Jimmy a tour of the complex, which had grown far beyond its humble beginnings.
There were multiple rehearsal spaces, classrooms for voice and movement training, a costume shop where local volunteers created beautiful period pieces, and walls covered with photographs of young actors who'd gone on to successful careers. "Look at this one," Robert said, stopping at a photo of a young man in graduation robes. "That's Michael. Came to us when he was 14, so shy he could barely speak above a whisper. Now he's directing films in Los Angeles. And this," he pointed to another photo, "is Sarah. She runs a theater program for disabled kids in Seattle now. Says what she learned here changed her whole life. This is incredible, Robert. You built all this?" "We built it. Me and hundreds of kids over the years, and volunteers from the community, and people who believe that stories matter, that giving young people a place to discover their voices matters." They ended the tour in Robert's office, a small cluttered room filled with scripts and photos and letters from former students. Robert poured them both coffee from an ancient pot, and they sat across from each other like the old men they'd become. The walls were covered with thank you letters, newspaper clippings about successful productions, and photos spanning 3 decades of young lives touched by theater. "Jimmy, can I ask you something?" "Shoot. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd gotten that part? If I'd become a movie star?" Jimmy thought about it, really thought about it. "Sometimes. Do you?" "All the time. And I think I would have been miserable. I would have spent my life chasing something that didn't matter to me. And now I know what I was put on earth to do. And Jimmy, so do you. All those actors you've helped, all those kids who got their start because you made a call. You think you would have done that if you hadn't felt responsible for me? Probably not. Then maybe that's the real story. Sometimes the worst mistake is really what makes you who you're supposed to be." They had dinner overlooking the mountains. 2 old men who'd found peace with a decision made in youth and fear. 6 months later, Robert sent a program from the theater's gala, dedicated to Mr. Bob Henley, who taught us that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as disappointments. At the bottom, Robert had written, "Thanks for taking that part, Jimmy. Greatest gift anyone ever gave me." Jimmy kept that program next to the 40-year-old letter on his kitchen table. 2 pieces of paper from 2 different times, telling the same story. Late at night, Jimmy would look at those letters and smile. Have you ever carried guilt for years only to discover you were completely wrong? Tell us about it in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible true stories. Thanks for watching.